I didn't know how long I had been standing inside the house because time wasn't moving. Time was accumulating here. With every second I breathed in, my throat tightened. My heartbeat sped up, as if the house had taken me outside of time but hadn't completely severed me from it. It was holding me suspended. I was standing, but the weight wasn't in my feet. It was in my chest. My heart rhythm had slowed. That was worse, because when the heart speeds up, a person feels alive. I had gone still. The silence of the house was no longer silence. Not like the absence of something, but like an excess of something. As if within the walls, unsaid sentences had accumulated. And if I made a wrong move, they would all spill out at once. I searched for file 017, not with my eyes, not with my hands, with instinct. When a person loses something, they search first with their eyes, then with their hands, and lastly, a void forms inside them. In me, the void had formed first. This file was no longer an object. It wasn't a record. It wasn't a document at all. It was a state, and I was inside that state. I leaned against the wall. I wanted to feel the cold. A reaction? Anything. But the wall was the same temperature as me. This couldn't be a coincidence. The house was using my body as a reference. The more I became fixed, the more it did as well. I moved, a very small movement, almost imperceptible. The house responded too. Not a creak, not a noise, a harmony. That was the moment I understood. This house didn't work with sound. It didn't work with image. It worked with harmony. And I was beginning to harmonize. I was doing it unwillingly. But unwillingness didn't stop the process. A single thought came to my mind. What would happen if I left here? The house gave the answer. Nothing happened. The door stood in front of me, but I would remain inside the house. Because leaving some places is not a physical act. To be able to leave, you must never have belonged there at all. And I was slowly beginning to belong. I looked at the clock. I don't know why I did. 3:17. But this wasn't a time. It was a sign, a threshold, the last clear reference point this house offered to humans. The line where it says, up to here, you were human. After that, undefined. And I wasn't standing on that line. I had crossed it, but I still thought I was walking. For a moment, I wanted to hear my own voice. I cleared my throat. I tried to speak. My voice came out, but that voice didn't feel like it belonged to me, like a recording being played back, as if I had formed the same sentences here before, with the same tone, with the same pauses. This realization didn't frighten me. It only felt exhausting, because when a person is afraid, they run. But when they are exhausted, they stay where they are. And the house wanted exactly that. Not for me to run, not for me to resist, for me to be permanent. At that moment, I realized the collapse had begun. But this wasn't an explosion, not a scream. This was a silent acceptance. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. When I realized I wasn't moving, I couldn't remember how long I had actually been motionless. This wasn't freezing. It wasn't a moment of panic. This was getting used to it. A person doesn't question what they've grown accustomed to, and they don't even notice that they're not questioning it. The house no longer felt foreign to me. That was more terrifying, because on the first day, the sense of unfamiliarity I felt the moment I opened the door was the only thing protecting me. Now it was gone. The floor wasn't creaking. The walls weren't cracking. Even the ceiling had fallen silent. The house had stopped disturbing me. which meant this: it had adjusted itself to me. I took a step, just one. The floor gently flexed right where my foot landed. It didn't collapse, but it wasn't solid either, as if it already knew where I would step. That thought made my stomach churn. Not like I was about to throw up, more like a slow discomfort pressing from the inside. As I walked through the house, I realized the rooms were changing places. No, I didn't notice it visibly. I noticed it only as a feeling. While standing inside one room, it felt like I was somewhere else. I was standing in the middle of the living room, but I was remembering a corridor I used to play in as a child. That memory didn't belong to me, because I had never seen this house before. But the house had seen me. I understood that. I thought of File 017, its pages, its warnings. To remember is to accept your place. When I first read that sentence, it had felt abstract. Now, it was painfully clear. The house was giving me memories that weren't mine, and I wasn't rejecting them. I stopped for a moment, deliberately. The house stopped too. This was a synchronization, and that synchronization was mutual. If I didn't move anymore, neither did it. This didn't mean the control was mine. It meant the control was shared. Shared control is not control. I saw a shadow at the edge of the wall. But this time I didn't run. I didn't look away. Because the shadow hadn't come to where I was looking. It was already there. Its shape wasn't clear, but it was familiar. I don't know how I knew that. Some things don't need to be clear to be familiar. That shadow wasn't watching me. It was measuring me, my breathing, my pauses, the length of my gaze, as if it had reached the final stage of something, and it was waiting for approval. At that moment, a thought formed inside me. It wasn't the house that brought me here. That thought weighed me down even more, because it was true. I came here on my own, with curiosity, with insistence, by continuing to read. The file may have been a trap, but I had accepted that trap by walking into it with my eyes open. The house knew this. That's why it no longer forced me. Forcing is for beings you cannot persuade. I had been persuaded. I just hadn't confessed it yet. When I found File 017, I wasn't surprised, because I wasn't looking for it. It had found me. It wasn't on the table. It wasn't on the floor. It wasn't on any surface. But my hand reached to the right spot. When my fingers touched the corner of the pages, I felt a faint vibration. This wasn't electricity. It wasn't warmth either. This was a response. The file knew it was being touched. I opened the page. There was a new heading. It wasn't like the previous ones. Not a warning, not a command, just a single sentence. We know you now. That sentence wasn't singular. How many were there knowing me? But there was no voice. This was the most dangerous tone that echoes in a person's mind, because sounds like this don't come from outside. They use the emptiness that already exists inside. The page continued. You did not resist. You adapted. This is rare. Something being rare doesn't mean it is good, but the file presented it as praise. And I couldn't reject that praise. To reject something, you need to stand on the other side. I was already inside. As I moved down the page, the words became sparse. The sentences grew longer. The meaning scattered, as if the file was adjusting itself to the span of my attention. On the last line, there was a single question. Are you ready? That question wasn't asking for an answer, because the answer had already been given. At that moment, There was a very slight change inside the house. A door didn't open. A light didn't turn on. But the air grew heavy. This wasn't the beginning of something, but the completion of something. The collapse wasn't reaching a peak. It was settling into place, and I was at the very center of that place. The darkness inside the house hadn't increased. The light hadn't diminished, but the shadows had multiplied. This wasn't a visual condition. The number of shadows wasn't increasing. The meaning of shadow was changing. Before, shadows formed when something blocked the light. Now, however, light was seeping through the shadows. This difference shook me for the first time, truly. Because this wasn't the laws of physics changing, it was the order of priority changing. Darkness was now fundamental. Light was the exception. I stood in front of a wall. I looked for my own shadow. It wasn't there, but on the wall, there was another shadow. When I moved, it didn't. When I stopped, it moved a little closer. This wasn't a reflection. This was a record, as if the house was still preserving someone who had stood here before me, and that someone had not yet been erased. For a moment, I spoke the thought that passed through my mind out loud. How many people were here? My voice didn't disappear inside the house. It came back, but the words had changed. How many people are here? That correction wasn't mine. The house was correcting verb tenses, because the past was no longer the past. Everyone who remained here was still here, just in different spaces. I noticed another shadow, then another. They didn't appear all at once. They were already there. I had become ready to notice them. None of these shadows were looking directly at me, but all of them were turned toward the same point. Not me, but my back. I slowly turned around. There was no one behind me, but the shadows knew someone was there. This realization didn't make me break out in a cold sweat. Something worse happened. A thought emerged inside me. It wasn't supposed to be there, meaning I was feeling the absence of someone. This was the most dangerous stage of the house, because now even things that didn't exist were having an effect. I remembered File 017. There was a sentence, one whose meaning I hadn't been able to decipher before. The shadow remains after the body. In that moment, I understood. In this house, people didn't leave. They just lost their priority. First the voice went, then the face, then the memory. All that remained was influence, and I had not yet been fully erased. That was why the house was interested in me. I was still processable. The shadows stopped watching me. They were waiting now. When I first realized I wasn't alone, there was no one in the room. That contradiction was the last point my mind could endure, because a person feels they are not alone when they see a presence. But I knew this without seeing anything. This knowledge didn't feel like a sensation. It felt like a decision, as if someone had already decided on my behalf. I took a breath. I didn't feel any wind, but something responded to my breathing. The pressure in my chest increased. My heart didn't race. On the contrary, it slowed down. When the heart slows, time stretches. When time stretches, a person thinks. And thinking was the most dangerous thing one could do in this house, because thoughts don't belong only to you. Here, thinking was broadcasting. I heard a whisper, but not with my ears. At the back of my head, "We noticed you." It was a plural voice, but unified. A single consciousness was using many traces. I didn't answer, but they knew no answer had been given. That silence didn't disturb them. On the contrary, They were pleased, because now they didn't need to speak to me. They were already inside me. For a moment, I saw myself from the outside. This wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dissociation either. This was relocation. I was no longer on the side that looked at me. That realization didn't cause panic, because panic comes with the feeling of losing control. I had already lost control. Now I was just watching the final stage. I heard the closing sound of file 017, but the file hadn't closed. That sound was the locking of a decision. There was no more reading, no choice, no warning, only execution. The house had accepted me, but I was still clinging to something. I thought of my name, my own name. That thought didn't echo inside me. It vanished into the void. And in that moment, I understood. I was still here, but I was no longer alone. And everything that would happen from now on would not be about me. I was only the first layer. When a person thinks of their name, they usually remember a face, a voice, a moment of being called. When I thought of my name, nothing came. This emptiness was not forgetfulness. This was cancellation. As if my name had never been heard, never spoken, never needed. The house was removing me from an identity, but it wasn't doing it by force. As it took from me, it didn't hurt me, because pain is born of resistance, and I wasn't resisting. I looked at the walls. I no longer saw surfaces. The walls were like interwoven layers. Each one belonged to a different time. Some had not yet been lived, some had long since ended. But all of them were here at the same time. This was the truth of the house. This wasn't a place. It was a pile. A place where memories, regrets, unfinished people were stacked on top of one another. And now I, too, was becoming part of that pile. For a moment, I saw a door. There was nothing written on it. But I knew what it was. This door was not an exit. This door was a void. I didn't move toward the door, but the house wasn't waiting for me to. The door came toward me, silently, without making a sound. This was the first time the house had moved physically, and that movement wasn't for me. I was already inside the decision. The door appeared right in front of me. It didn't open. It didn't need to, because some things don't happen by opening, but by disappearing. My name wasn't erased from my mind. Something worse happened. The idea settled in me that my name might never have existed. That idea didn't disturb me. That was dangerous too, because when a person accepts their own absence, they are no longer defenseless. And the house doesn't shelter the defenseless. It uses them. When I first realized the house was speaking to me, I didn't hear a voice. It wasn't a language either. This was a notification, as if a decision had been placed inside me. You are here. This wasn't an observation. It wasn't a judgment. It was a constant, an unchangeable state. The house no longer saw me as a guest. I wasn't a subject either. I was a layer. It wasn't placing me into the walls, or the floor, or the ceiling. It was placing me into depth. Suddenly, everything became heavy. But this wasn't physical weight. Meaning became heavy. My thoughts began to last longer. Completing an idea didn't take time. Time itself was being embedded into the idea. The house was aligning my thinking to its own rhythm. I was no longer asking questions. The questions were coming to me, and the answers arrived before the questions. This was the inversion of consciousness, and that inversion didn't irritate me, because irritation requires contradiction. There was no contradiction here, only one direction. At one point, I heard my own voice, but I wasn't speaking. The voice was coming from inside the house, with my tone, with my pauses, with my breathing intervals. The house wasn't imitating me, it was multiplying me, and that multiplication was making me unnecessary. Because if something can be multiplied, the original is not required. In that moment, I understood others would take my place. With my voice, with my fears, with my collapsed state. And those watching wouldn't even realize it, because the house loved this most of all, replacing things without being noticed. I can't say anymore that I was being watched. But being watched isn't the right word either, because watching is done from a distance. There was no distance here. They weren't looking at me. They were in the same place as me. It took time for me to understand this difference, because a person doesn't easily accept that something can be this close to them. I took a breath, or I thought I did, but the breath didn't belong to me. My chest moved, but I hadn't willed it. This was the body still functioning while control had completely changed hands. People usually think they realize they've lost control all at once. That isn't true. Control first becomes insignificant. Then it becomes unnecessary. And only at the end is its absence noticed. I was at that final stage. There was a movement inside the house. But again, there was no sound. This wasn't a vibration. It wasn't a shifting shadow either. This was attention changing places. The house was no longer watching me. Those who were watching me were watching me. And these watchers weren't singular, but they weren't many either. They were fragments. Those who came before me, those who would come after me, and right now, those who were listening. This awareness didn't frighten me, because the house had already stripped fear away. What remained was only naked consciousness, and naked consciousness cannot defend itself. A thought came, if I'm here, who is listening to me? The answer to that question wasn't in the room. The answer was being wanted by someone right now. This file wasn't a narrative. It wasn't a record either. This file was a structure. And everyone who listened stood in front of that structure. Some would impasse, some would. But all of them would deny that they were standing there. Because denial was the house's favorite form of defense. One last time I tried to remember my name. This wasn't a reflex, it was a habit. But habits couldn't survive here. My name didn't come. Instead, a void came. That void didn't swallow me. It placed me into my position. There was nothing left to escape from. There was nowhere left to collapse. I had been placed where I was meant to be. And in that moment, I understood this. This file hadn't found me. This house hadn't chosen me. I had already been here. I just hadn't remembered. Now I remember. And if you're listening to this, you're here now too.